Hi, Lagim fam. Before I start with the show, I want to introduce you to another friend of this podcast, and they are all about two of my favorite things, true crime and wine. Here is their trailer.
Whitney and I met through our husbands who were childhood friends, but quickly bonded in several aspects. We realized that we had many commonalities, both boy moms, both loved wine, and both intrigued by true crime.
Early on in our friendship, we also learned that our histories allotted us to have differing opinions that creates a healthy conversation. Not only do we love listening to the cases that baffle our minds, but we are advocates for those that crimes were committed against. Victims do not get a chance to tell their story, but we can.
We bring awareness and fight for justice for those that cannot fight themselves.
Melissa and I spend hours weekly going through newspaper articles, past interviews, news reports, and anything that we can bring to listeners for a complete journey. Our mission is to create awareness in the only way we know how.
We say something because we will be there.
No matter where,
no matter who.
Make sure to check them out and follow them on Instagram at Colts Crimes Cab or check the link below in the show notes. And now on to the show. One of the many failings of the age of colonialism and imperialism is the erasure of indigenous cultures all around the world. Stemming from that failure came this belief that they are the old world, the backwards thinking, the ones who do not have a place in our modern world. So we disrespect them, ignore them and their culture, refuse to teach our children about them, and we choose to never heed their advice as to how to better take care of our planet. Something they've always done because of their respect for Mother Earth. Add to all that a post-colonial education and a post-colonial Manila-centric style of government that made us all think that those people belonging to certain tribes dressed in traditional garb or wanting to fight for ancestral lands are just raging leftists or communist lunatics and a great hindrance to progress, and you have the perfect formula for the erasure of indigenous communities in the Philippines. And that is how Ferdinand Marcos Sr. viewed this one man from Kalinga when he decided that several dams must be built in the Cordilleras. What he could not anticipate was that the man who stood 5'6" tall, the man who mostly walked barefoot around his village, would do everything in his power to stop the intrusion into the lands of his ancestors, even if it meant losing his own life for the good of many. This is the case of Macli-ing Dulag. Mabuhay Lagim fam! Welcome to the last installment of my martial law series here at Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Thank you for the positive feedback you have provided so far, and thank you for all the case suggestions as well. Just note that after this episode, I will be taking a break just to have some time to recuperate. In the meantime, I will most probably be releasing a re-recording of an old episode from my old Patreon account on the Caroline Crouch case, just as I promised a few weeks ago. It is not a very long episode as far as I can remember, so maybe treat this episode as a pantawid gutom, something to tide you over until I am back for episode 12, which is going to be a longer episode. As always, if you want to support my podcast, please consider becoming a patron to get ad-free early access to my regular episodes. You can also use my affiliate links in the show notes for places like Shopee, Lazada, Canva, and Kiwi.com. And lastly, you can make a one-off donation through buymecoffee.com. As always, please be warned that details in this episode might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. Berta Isabel Cáceres was a Honduran environmentalist and indigenous rights activist who also belonged to the Lenca people, a Mesoamerican indigenous group that occupy parts of southwestern Honduras and eastern parts of El Salvador. Before the Spanish colonization, the Lenca people enjoyed a good relationship with some Mayan groups and other indigenous groups. The Lenca people were stewards of nature owing to their pre-colonial religious beliefs in sacred mountains and hills being holy places. Berta started her activism in 1993, but her biggest fight was in 2006 when she was asked to investigate the construction of dams near Rio Blanco. She would not know peace after that. She was constantly threatened and harassed to the point that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2009 put her on a list of people under threat during the 2009 Honduran coup d'etat. Sadly, by 2016, Berta was shot dead in her home by armed intruders who were said to have acted under orders from people who had vested interests in the building of the dams that would destroy the ancestral lands of her people. Before her death, she had written a message of encouragement for the people of Ifugao, who she knew were and are still facing constant pressure and threats from the government and its agents, who also want to build more dams and have partially already succeeded in doing so in the Cordilleras. Berta's message of encouragement came at a time when the Philippines was poised to be named as the most murderous country for environmental defenders. This is an extremely sad thought because environmental defenders, especially those belonging to indigenous groups, have known for a long time that sacrificing nature for the sake of progress does not only mean disrespecting it, but can only spell disaster in the long run. One of the more prominent people who knew this was Macli-ing Dulag. Historians are not entirely sure when exactly Macli-ing was born, but there is a somewhat general consensus that he was born in 1930. He belonged to the Butbut ethno-linguistic people and lived in the village of Bugnay in Tinglayan, Kalinga. He had always been a respected elder and at some point served 3 terms as a barrio captain of Bugnay. Macli-ing did not have any formal education, but he was a much admired and respected speaker. When he spoke, there was power and gravitas, and people listened. As part of the Butbut tribe, Macli-ing was one of now almost 17 million indigenous peoples in the Philippines who belong to 110 ethno-linguistic groups. Now I know what you're thinking. Aren't we all indigenous to the Philippines since we are all Filipinos or descended from Filipinos? In the North American context, the understanding of who is indigenous is a bit more clear-cut because if you are not someone whose ancestors came in from Europe or elsewhere from the 15th century onwards, chances are you are indigenous to North America. But in a country like the Philippines, why do we make the distinction when we are all descended from other Filipinos? Without getting too anthropological on you, here's my understanding of why that is. The term indigenous peoples, when applied to the Philippines, is a bit of a misnomer. In a Filipino context, the term indigenous peoples refer to those ethno-linguistic groups and subgroups that were, in my opinion, fortunate enough to maintain partial isolation or independence from the colonization that took place in the rest of the country. Yes, if you have Filipino blood, you are most likely a descendant of some ancestral group indigenous to the Philippines, but your ancestry, just like my Filipino ancestry, has been Christianized and colonized a long time ago. Almost 90% of our current Filipino population is from tribal groups that have been long lost to either our history of being colonized or as a result of intermarriages with other foreign groups. The only true culturally indigenous peoples in the country are those belonging to the Igorot groups, the Bugkalot groups, the Lumad, the Aita, and the Dumagat. There are others, of course, but the ones I mentioned are the biggest groups. Philippine law actually defines indigenous peoples, and the definition is a bit of a mouthful, but let me read it out. Indigenous peoples are a group of people or homogeneous societies identified by self-ascription who have continuously lived as an organized community on communally bounded and defined territory, and who have, under claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed customs, traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits, or who have, through resisting political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religions and culture become historically differentiated from the majority of Filipinos. In very simplified terms, for which I may get in trouble, you are part of an indigenous or ethno-linguistic group in the Philippines if you are of a community that has largely been untouched by colonialism, both mainly in terms of culture and religion. In my case, for example, on my maternal side, I know that my grandparents were migrants from Visayas into Mindanao, and I can trace my maternal ancestry back to San Carlos Negros Occidental, but no one in my family can trace our ancestry back to pre-colonial times to know which tribe we might have belonged to. Now, there is evidence in my case that there were several ethno-linguistic subgroups on Negros that mainly belonged to the bigger Aita group, but by the 17th century, the Aitas were as good as driven away by Filipino Christians who established themselves there rather forcefully, I might say, for the sole purpose of Christianizing that part of Negros. So that history is lost, and whatever group my ancestors belonged to was colonized and is long forgotten. And this is exactly the opposite of what happened to a lot of the ethno-linguistic groups in the Cordilleras, a location that was difficult to access for the Spanish and remains difficult if you do not have the right means and local connections. People like Macli-ing Dulag were and are proud of this heritage. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have always had to fight for their rights to remain on their lands and to access the sources from those lands. And this all came to a head during the 70s when Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was president and subsequently declared martial law in 1972. So when did Macli-ing Dulag and Marcos metaphorically cross paths? Well, I think in order to answer that question, it is best to run through how the Chico River Dam project came about and all the other events afterwards. The Chico River Dam project was first proposed in 1965. It was supposed to be a multi-purpose facility that would serve to help with irrigation and the generation of hydropower. At that time, the project was not really that much of a priority, but that all changed when the whole world went through the great oil crisis of 1973 and 1974. Countries who were dependent on oil for energy suddenly had to quickly think of ways to make up for the lack of oil as an energy source. The Chico Dam project suddenly looked very attractive and was quickly prioritized. Marcos Sr. asked the World Bank for funds to construct a total of 4 dams in the Mountain Province and Kalinga areas. Marcos wanted to push through the project without consulting the indigenous peoples who quite literally lived by the riverbanks of the Chico River. So, in an effort to hasten the start of the project and to entice the World Bank to release the project funds, the Filipino government commissioned a German engineering firm named La Maya International GmbH, now called Tractable Engineering based in Frankfurt, to conduct technical feasibility studies, which were then handed in by the firm in 1973. The report by the German firm was clear that should the project push through Bontoc and Kalinga villages, those villages would be inundated once the Chico River and other small rivers were diverted to generate hydroelectric power. These findings were disregarded both by the government and the World Bank, and the funds were released. Still, no dialogue or consultation took place with any of the indigenous peoples who would be displaced if the dams were to be built. By 1974, NAPOCOR, or the National Power Corporation, started surveying the area where the dams would be built. Only at this point did the indigenous peoples in the area learn about what was about to happen to their home. Some protests were organized, but it was around this time that Macli-ing Dulag and other elders from Kalinga and Bontoc spoke against the project. Eventually, some of the indigenous peoples organized themselves and traveled to Malacanang to see President Marcos themselves. According to reports and stories from the protesters at that time, Marcos was not the gracious civil servant that he was supposed to be. Marcos was said to have scolded the indigenous peoples who came to air their grievances. He told them that they needed to sacrifice something on behalf of national development. Sometime later after this visit, Marcos sent his presidential assistant for national minorities to the Chico River area on a mission to appease and perhaps to bribe the indigenous peoples living there. And what did Marcos offer the residents of Kalinga and Bontoc? He tried to entice them with truckloads of food, chocolate bars, basketballs, flashlights, and other trinkets, clearly underestimating the dedication and commitment the indigenous peoples had for their land. In a way, the late dictator mocked their intellect by thinking that some shiny new gifts could seriously turn public opinion on the dam project. I also think that Marcos seriously thought that the indigenous peoples in and around the Chico River were simpletons. He could not be more wrong. Now let's go back to Macli-ing Dulag. He was a pangat, or a village elder. Beyond the authority he already possessed as an elder, he was also very eloquent, calm, and full of courage. People who had met him back in the 70s remembered his words as having an almost mystical and spiritual effect. When he spoke, people fell silent and listened. Macli-ing understood immediately what the dam project meant for his people and their homes along the river. He expressed very early on during the resistance that he was prepared to die for the lands of his ancestors. Macli-ing and the indigenous peoples who would be affected by the dam project knew from the get-go that if the government insisted on the project along the Chico River, they would lose their livelihoods and culture. The project would submerge sacred lands from south of Bontoc to north of Tomiyangan in Tabuk, Kalinga. In Tabuk alone, 6 barangays would be submerged, displacing around 100,000 Kalinga and Bontoc indigenous peoples. All these concerns were made clear during their visit to Malacanang earlier and in subsequent dialogues with representatives of the government. Now, when the truckloads of food and chocolate bars did not work in swaying the opinions of Macli-ing and the others, Marcos sent their emissaries to offer financial incentives if the communities agreed to relocate. These offers were rejected immediately. The indigenous peoples communicated to the dictator that relocating was never an option because for them, leaving their homes meant abandoning their ancestors whose spirits they believed still roamed the lands. When it became clear to the indigenous peoples that the government would not back down and would come back with more ploys to convince them to leave their homes, the different tribal communities were called to meet for a so-called bodong, a sort of peace pact that also served to cement alliances. Macli-ing called upon his community and neighboring communities, even those who were at war with each other, to come together in order to strengthen their collective dissent of Marcos's plans. So, whilst the Napocor continued their surveying of the lands and rivers with the military as their personal security guards, the indigenous peoples were slowly but surely realizing that the only way to fight off these project plans was to unite and do away with any mistrust and conflicts between them. After all, they all had at that point one common enemy: President Marcos Sr. During the first bodong, mainly attended by men, the women also made sure to do their part in warding off those who worked with Napocor and who were still surveying their communities. The women dismantled Napocor's campsite and then performed a so-called lusay, the act of disrobing and flaunting their tattooed torsos and limbs in front of the soldiers and surveyors in order to bring them bad luck. When I read about the lusay in the course of my research, I immediately thought about the haka by the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I somehow had a picture in my mind of these badass, strong indigenous women who not only warded off the Napocor surveyors and soldiers with their tattooed bodies, but also may have appeared to the Napocor people as some sort of harbinger of something rather sinister. I'd like to think that for the Napocor people, these indigenous women were fearsome to behold. By May 1975, Macli-ing ramped up his efforts. In a school in Quezon City, he called a gathering of 150 pangats or village elders in order to formally produce an agreement called the Pagta Ti Bodong, which for the first time in a long time would formally unite Bontoc and Kalinga indigenous groups in opposition to Marcos. Macli-ing and the other pangats, by being in the nation's capital, also managed to get some exposure from non-indigenous Filipinos, some of whom supported their cause. Macli-ing and the communities behind him received overwhelming support from religious groups and other activist organizations. As the calls to call off the projects grew louder, not only out of the Cordilleras but nationwide, Marcos and Napocor temporarily called off the project and withdrew their presence from Kalinga and the Bontoc communities. But in case you thought Marcos would not come back with a vengeance, then clearly you have not been paying attention to the last 6 weeks on this podcast. Marcos was, unsurprisingly, hell-bent on getting those dams built, and he realized that he needed to neutralize the growing opposition in the Cordilleras. So, in order to do so, he formed the Kalinga Special Development Region by presidential decree. This region included the municipalities of Lubuangan, Tinglayan, Tanudan, and Pasil. As you may remember from a few minutes ago, Macli-ing himself was from Tinglayan. He then ordered the military to move into this region. The 51st and 60th Philippine Constabulary Brigades and the 44th Philippine Army Brigade were ordered to occupy this newly formed region and were also there to strengthen the Philippine Constabulary that was already present in that area. Marcos needed these drastic measures to produce the results he needed. By April 1977, 150 locals and pangats were arrested without warrants by state agents. They were all accused of subversion and obstruction. They were thrown into prison, but that never weakened the resolve of those 150 locals and the ones who were witnessing the violence perpetrated on their communities from outside the prison cells. In fact, the opposite happened. The indigenous peoples mobilized further and a larger bodong was organized in June 1978. This, of course, did not sit well with the Marcos government. In retaliation, Marcos ordered that parts of the Chico River be declared as so-called free fire zones, meaning that there will be a strip of land around the river where it would be allowed for the military to shoot at trespassers without legal consequences. I think it would not be a stretch of the imagination that this new order from the late dictator cost the communities near the river a few lives. I could not find any definitive numbers, but I feel confident in assuming that if no one had actually been killed, at the very least, life near the Chico River would become more dangerous and unbearable, and also restrictive because of the establishment of these free fire zones. Nevertheless, the increasing presence of the military in the region did not deter the indigenous peoples from mobilizing continuously. In fact, by December 1979, the village elders organized yet another bodong, and this time this momentous event was attended by around 3,000 indigenous peoples. It was during this bodong that Macli-ing was officially chosen as the spokesperson for this very important cause. It has to be noted, though, that even before this official designation in 1979, Macli-ing was, in my opinion, and always had been the de facto voice and image of the movement. Back in 1975, in fact, parts of a statement he gave during the Pagtati Bodong in Quezon City were used in a statement and poster. A U.S.-American human rights volunteer who traveled to the Cordilleras in the 70s said of Macli-ing the following things, quote, "For me, he was a teacher. His words, stance, his charisma, and stubborn insistence on the sanctity of his people's land taught me that there were places in the Philippines where money did not speak and where power resided in something other than strength." End of quote. Now, in that short quote, the American volunteer referenced money and power as things that never really seduced Macli-ing, and he was probably referring to the fact that Marcos offered Macli-ing in those early years of the dam project opposition a lot of money and a government position in the Kalinga Special Development Region. He even offered Macli-ing women in exchange for his consent. But as we know, Macli-ing never budged. Now, before I proceed with the rest of the timeline in this case, I think there is merit in briefly clarifying the common belief that indigenous peoples in the Philippines, particularly those in the Cordilleras, were also members of the CPP-NPA or were intimately aligned with them. I think we ought to truly understand the interplay between these two groups, especially during the dark years of Marcos's martial law era, because lumping them together is very dangerous in an age of disinformation and in an age when red tagging any leftist activists has become quite common and extremely dangerous, as demonstrated by the Calabarzon killings last year. Do you know when people say two things can be true at the same time? Well, that certainly applies in this case. So, fact number one, the indigenous peoples around the Chico River were against the government's dam project, and they had managed to organize themselves as a formidable opposition with national and international support. Fact number two, during the dam project opposition movement in the 70s, when Macli-ing Dulag became the leader and spokesperson for his fellow indigenous peoples, there existed a contingency of the CPP-NPA in that area as well. Now, whilst it can be argued that standing up to Marcos and his plan to submerge and therefore destroy indigenous communities in the Cordilleras was and is a rather leftist thing to do, those who had researched and written intensively about Macli-ing argued that he himself did not align with the communist rebel group, nor was he a member. Others in his community may have decided to do so before or during the dam project opposition movement, but Dulag himself was believed to have been way above that. His dedication to stop the building of the dams transcended any type of political or philosophical ideology. The CPP-NPA knew themselves and fully acknowledged that Bugnay, for example, where Macli-ing lived, was Macli-ing territory. A volunteer human rights worker from a Methodist church once said, quote, "Whatever the influence of the left in the area, it was clear that Bugnay was Macli-ing territory. The local cadre of the NPA knew that they should defer to him and that it was Macli-ing whose voice counted in Bugnay. His presence was both a warning and a comfort to an outsider. The warning came in knowing that this well-muscled man with his fierce hawk-like eyes held sway in this village, and that one was well advised to behave honorably toward him and his people." End of quote. Now here is another fact. The close ties to the NPA produced a 1978 peace pact between the NPA in that area and the indigenous peoples opposing the dam project. But like I said, the NPA knew better than to assume that Macli-ing and his community were there to align themselves with the communist struggle. The struggle of the indigenous peoples was called Kayao, and it was and remains an indigenous concept that is unlike the NPA's call to arms. As explained by Nestor Castro, a cultural anthropologist, the struggle, the Kayao of the indigenous peoples, especially the Butbuts, to which Macli-ing belonged, transcended and still transcends the simple taking up of weapons to fight the government. Kayao denotes a struggle for land, the land of one's ancestors and everything that is considered holy and sacred in it. As Maria Ceres Doyo wrote in her book about Macli-ing, there are still apologists out there who believe that the Chico River project was a good thing. They are the same people who think that what happened to Macli-ing later on was justified because of this alliance with the NPA, as if an allegiance or good relations with the left, with a capital L of course, justified any state-sponsored violence. Nevertheless, despite all this, the Marcosian-controlled media and government agents went to great lengths in depicting the indigenous peoples in and around the Chico River as communist rebels. I suppose it was easy to sell this image of the indigenous peoples because there was and still is such a visceral reaction to anything or anyone that is connected to communism, especially the NPA. For me, I truly believe that Macli-ing and most members of his community, despite understanding what the NPA stood for, knew that their fight as indigenous peoples was so much more than what the NPA was fighting for. An alliance was okay for practical and strategic purposes, but ideologically, the indigenous peoples and the NPA were different. Having said all that, let us now jump back into our timeline. after the establishment of the free fire zones, we now jump forward to 1980. On the 24th of April 1980, almost a dozen individuals in 2 trucks, later to be identified as military agents from the 4th Infantry Division of the Army, arrived in Bugnay looking for Macli-ing and his neighbor Pedro Dungok, another vocal opponent of the dam project. The military agents were led by someone named Lieutenant Leodegario Adalem. When the individuals found Macli-ing and Dungok's homes, they told Macli-ing, or rather shouted from outside, to exit his home. Macli-ing refused. He told them to return the next day. Inside his home, Macli-ing told his wife to hold the door closed so he could lock it. Because he needed light to do so, he lit a lamp. Outside, the military agents initially only saw darkness from the Dulag home, but as soon as the lamp was lit, it gave them an indication as to where Macli-ing was at that very second. They immediately opened fire through a slit under a door. Macli-ing was killed instantly. Meanwhile, his neighbor Peter Dungok noticed the commotion taking place near his home. He knew that the military agents were coming for him next. He arranged a bunch of pillows to look like him underneath his blanket and then hid nearby. Sure enough, Adalem's men came bursting into his home and started shooting at the pillows, thinking it was Peter. By then, Peter was long gone and on the run, only sustaining a small injury on his wrist. In the aftermath of Macli-ing's murder, his community would soon learn that his body sustained injuries from 10 bullets. However, his death did not dampen or discourage the movement. If anything, it strengthened and unified even more Indigenous peoples than ever before. They mobilized whenever they could, and they made explicit references to Macli-ing's murder as they moved to oppose Marcos's Chico River dam project. When it became clear that the opposition would not back down and that they were garnering more and more support from all over the place, Marcos and his funder, the World Bank, were forced to abandon the project. As for the agents who murdered Macli-ing, they were soon thrown under the bus by their own government. Well, at least for a moment. The Defense Ministry recommended the filing of cases against Lieutenant Adalem and his men. The ministry informed Amnesty International about this, but whether these cases and other consequences were actually implemented could not be ascertained by the human rights organization. What little I could find about the men who murdered Macli-ing came from snippets of Doyo's book on the subject, as I could not order the book in time for this episode. It seems that at least 4 men, including Lieutenant Adalem, were charged and later court-martialed. Another 2 were apprehended but not charged at all. The 4 who were charged were found guilty, but here is the kicker. Lieutenant Adalem was later covertly reinstated as part of the military and then much later on restored to active duty. He then comfortably retired as a major, pension and all, before dying in an ambush in 2000. Like in so many cases I have covered on this podcast, Macli-ing never got the justice he deserved. However, he also did not die in vain because the dam was never built after Marcos and the World Bank pulled out following Macli-ing's murder. In that way, Macli-ing got what he wanted and his ancestral lands remained protected. Macli-ing Dulag's name is now part of the Bantayog ng mga Bayani Wall of Remembrance, and in his native of Bugnay, a monument was also built in his memory and in honor of his work, dedication, and the love he had shown his people and their ancestral lands. But the struggle continues. Dam projects are being planned and started in a lot of locations in the country. And whilst that is a complex and big case on its own that I cannot tackle in this episode, please know that resources exist out there for your information and whenever you want to read up on them. Now, before I end this episode, there are two things I want to highlight. Firstly, these projects in our country are not solely being funded or being made possible by foreign money. Companies connected to the Aboitiz and Ayala families and other elite Philippines corporations named after dynastic clans and families are very much involved in existing and planned hydropower projects. You can look up companies like SNAP, SNAP, or SN Aboitiz Power, or the Quad River Energy Corporation, because the former is an Aboitiz-related entity and the latter is an Ayala-related entity. The second thing I want to put to you is that the violence and even murders of Indigenous peoples over hydropower projects are still happening to this very day, and it happens regardless of who is sitting in Malacanang. These anti-dam activists are being red-tagged, vilified, and surveilled heavily by the military every day. In a research conducted by Lawrence L. Delina, a researcher at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and whose work I have used profusely for this episode, he stated that whilst the Marcos government killed Macli-ing Dulag and countless other Indigenous peoples, the Aquino government, for example, also killed 129. Now, I'm not sure if he meant Cory's government or Noynoy's government. He then went on to say that the Duterte government at the time of his research in 2019 had managed to kill 32 Indigenous peoples. Delina also warned that as project development in Indigenous communities through Duterte's Build program becomes more aggressive, more killings of Indigenous peoples will happen. And now the Philippines has voted in yet another Marcos into Malacanang. So who knows what will happen to this Build program and what it will mean to Indigenous communities. I think it will either be very different or it will be pursued even more aggressively. So, as I was reading up on this case, I realized that the Igorot identity was strengthened and solidified after Macli-ing's murder. However, the younger generation is still in danger of perhaps forgetting about him and what he stood for, something that is worrying, really. TV personality Howie Severino once visited the Cordilleras and stood in a classroom full of young Indigenous peoples. He asked them whether they knew who Macli-ing Dulag was. None of them had a clue. Now, whether this was just editing, unfortunate editing that seemed like no one said yes to Severino's question, or whether this school was not anywhere near Bugnay or any of the villages who were active in the opposition back in the 70s, it still gave me an uneasy feeling. We are living in an age where we almost have an overload of information through the internet, and yet these kids, it would seem, did not have a clue about a fellow Indigenous person. If this is a true reflection of what the youth does and does not know, then there is so much work to be done. So, Lagim fam, make sure you read up and talk about Macli-ing, the Igorot, the dam projects of the 70s during the martial law era, the Indigenous peoples of the Philippines, because now more than ever, their stories need to be told in order for them to be protected as well. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to our last installment in this martial law series. I truly enjoyed all the feedback you've given me so far, so please keep them coming. I already have planned on covering 2 cases from the martial law era for next season after receiving so many suggestions, so you can look forward to that in season 4. As always, if you found this episode and my podcast interesting and of value, make sure to look at the show notes to read about all the ways you can support me as an independent podcaster and content creator. Also, make sure to follow me on social media, especially Instagram, for updates and the occasional true crime meme. Thank you again, daghang salamat at mabuhay.